So this is a new class, pretty excited about it. Love endgames. Love talking to students about endgames. And how many of you have been to an endgame class here before? Okay, excellent. So I'm sure everybody does different things. Today we're gonna look at a game from the biggest tournament going on right now. Anybody know what that is? Tata Steel is going on, and who's playing in it? Anybody know some really top players that are playing in it? Yeah, Magnus Carlsen is playing it, and he is winning right now. But today we're going to take a look at another game that's going on in that tournament. Maxime Vachier-Lagrave. Does anybody recognize that name? Yeah? He was also here playing in the Singfield Cup in August, so not too long ago. And Hou Yifan. Anybody know anything about her? Can you tell me a little bit about Hou Yifan? Somebody? Yes. Yes, and she is the top-rated woman active right now in the world since Judith Polgar recently announced her retirement. And she is very high-rated, and now she is starting to get invitations to these elite events like Tata Steel Chess, which was kind of similar when Judith was playing actively. She was always invited to these top events, so it's nice to see Hou also getting invited to such elite tournaments. So in this game, it's not yet an endgame, but it'll be an endgame pretty soon. Spoiler alert, unfortunately, you know it's going to be an endgame because it's an endgame class. But one thing that I think is most important about endgames for players is when do you want to get into an endgame, and understanding how high the stakes are when your opponent offers you a trade of queens, which usually leads to an endgame. Now, technically, the definition of an endgame is not whether or not queens are on the board, but what? At least this is what I was taught. And I think it's the most useful distinction, is that an endgame is not about checkmating your opponent, but rather what? In an endgame, instead of trying to checkmate your opponent, you're usually trying to do what first? Yes? Promote pawns, yeah. It's really simple. And that's why one metric of whether or not it's an endgame or not is your king safe in the center of the board? If the answer is yes, it's probably an endgame. That's why a trade of queens does not necessarily guarantee an endgame, because there are some positions where there are no queens on the board, but there's so many rooks and minor pieces that king safety is still an issue, right? And of course, this is a generalization. It doesn't apply to all situations, because we know there are still some freak occurrences of a checkmate in the middle of the board, even with only a couple pieces left. But let's take a look at this position. So MVL is playing white here, and what's the first move you might look at if you're playing white here? One of the first moves. Of course, we should always be looking at the forcing moves in every position. So what are some of the forcing moves in this position? Yeah? So you would look at bishop h7 check, good. That is a forcing move, and it needs to be looked at. But you don't really accomplish that much after king to h8, right? Unfortunately, you just don't have a lot of firepower. And if you could reverse the place of the queen and the bishop, life would be quite nice indeed. But unfortunately, that's not in the rules of chess, and it would be way too slow to try to do that. Black would have ample ways to stop you from checkmating them. Like, just for example, like even if we got a bunch of free moves in a row, and we could do this battery, which by the way is usually a good idea. Even in this situation, black would be able to just like stunt it with bishop f5, right? Interfering with the queen and the diagonal. So I think the conclusion is that in this position, white doesn't really have enough pieces to realistically get a checkmating attack on the king. I mean, the only other minor piece besides this beautiful bishop is this knight on a3. And the knight, of course, is nowhere near being able to attack the king. So usually you just, like if you had a dark squared bishop, for instance, it would maybe be a little bit different. But with just a couple minor pieces, it's really tough. In fact, as a rule of thumb, another generalization that's not always true, if you're trying to attack an enemy king, you usually want two minor pieces because that often gives you enough firepower. This doesn't really count as two because this one is not participating in a potential attack. So, like for instance, if you had a knight on h5, you might have some attacking potential. but usually 2 is the minimum, and more means likely attack. That's a rule of thumb they use a lot for when you have an isolated queen pawn. But anyway, what other moves would you look at here besides bishop h7 check and besides queen h7 check? Mate, king. It's not allowed. Yeah?
Queen c7?
Queen c7 I would definitely look at. That's a nice forcey move, right? You're attacking the queen, you're attacking b7, and I'd also probably look at queen c5. Queen c7 was actually played in the game by MBL. So this is a very natural move, right? Like otherwise, why do you have your queen and your rook like this? Because black's just going to play rook c8 next move and contest the file himself, right? So queen c7 is extremely logical. And now the big question for black is to trade or not to trade. You know, try to delay it, move your queen away, get some fun things going on, or to just go for the trade immediately. So I'll have you guys take a little think on this, and then we'll vote. And whatever you vote on, Maxime will do. Although the game is already over, so maybe not. All right, let's vote now. So how many people, if you were black, if you were Hou Yifan in this position, would play queen takes queen? Okay? How many people would do something else and try to keep queens on the board? All right, well, you did, by the way, I'm sorry, I mixed up. I was asking you a question for Hou's point of view, not Maxime's, but both very strong grandmasters, so I'm sure you would have played the same move regardless of the question. But Hou in this position did avoid the trade of queens, so good job. But I'm not so sure queen takes c7 is a terrible move. In fact, I thought there were some really interesting variations that arose from it. Like, when you first look at it, it doesn't look that great because it looks like the rook is just getting to this beautiful 7th rank square, which is really important in the endgame. But then it doesn't seem as bad because black does have a key move to kind of cobble everything together here. What move can black play here? Where? Well, you could go put the bishop back to c8, but that's not very desirable. Instead, yeah? Yeah, c6 is much more desirable because now the bishop defends this, but you can also retain some defense on the c file, right? So that's a decent move. And now, like, suppose white were to play rook e1 here to, make a move like rook e7. Well, you could just play something like rook to e8, and now suppose they play rook takes. Well, I don't know. Like, I'm trying to make a bad move for white, honestly. But like, say after rook takes e8, rook takes e8, now they play like king f1 so that you can't play rook e1 check, right? What move does black have here? Now, to be fair, this variation is not forced. It's not like Hou Yifan would have gotten this and won against Maxime, but I think it's just a very funny line. Somebody's already got it, but let me give you the rest of you a little bit of a chance. This is one of those moves that's like, it's not deep, it's just one move, but it's very unusual, so it's not always that easy to find. Sometimes there's actually a famous position that Anna Zatansky first showed me, the many times U.S. women's champion, who comes here every year for the women's championship, where it's made in one, but it takes most people several minutes to find it. So sometimes one move can still be hard to find. And when I say most people, I don't mean like people who just started to play chess. I mean like everyone. So what is the best move here for black? That is the question. You got it? Always look at the forcey moves. The forcey move is, first of all, checks and captures, but right after checks and captures come moves that attack bigger pieces, right? So bigger pieces could be a queen. There are no queens in this position, so what's the next thing? Exactly. So you want to look at things that attack biggest pieces, because if they can't be defended, then you end up winning material. That's a forcing move. Yes? Yeah, so knight a8 is a cool move here. And look, the rook doesn't have anywhere to go. So white would have to sacrifice the rook for a bishop and a pawn. So definitely a reasonable idea to play queen takes c7 instead. But this is the kind of stuff that you have to go through when you're deciding whether or not to trade queens. It's a critical decision, so you need to make sure both to think about it in terms of, well, words, right? In chess, sometimes you have to describe your decisions in words. So if I look at this in turn and I try to think about it in words, I would usually reject it. Because I would say, well, this rook is coming to the 7th rank and I don't like that. It's a very active square, so I don't want to do that. My weaknesses are going to really get pounded on and maybe I'll lose the game. But then if I start looking at variations and get a little bit more concrete, I see, well, hey, wait a second, I have some resources here. So you really need to do both things, especially when a critical situation comes up, like a queen trade. A queen trade changes the nature of a chess game so drastically that you always want to think longer on that decision than you would on average in another decision. And that's something that I'd love you all to take away from this. Instead, Hou played a very aggressive move, queen to f6, attacking the pawn on h4, and hoping that she would generate enough counterplay if Maxime took the pawn on b7, which he did. And she did retain some counterplay. In fact, she won the pawn back on b2. She was also attacking h4, but this one now attacks the knight on a3. So Maxime wanted to keep his queen activity while defending this knight. So he played queen a3, queen d6. It also puts pressure on this d5 pawn. So now another offering of queen trade. So now look at it from White's point of view and tell me yay or nay. So remember, the pawn count is now even. But of course, White's structure is better. 2 islands as opposed to 3. Well, how many people here would trade queens in this position as White? Raise your hand. How many people would reject the queen trade offer and do something else? All right, so, well, in this position, Maxime did decide to trade the queens because partly, did anybody have a reason why in this position? Yeah?
Well, every single one of the pawns are isolated.
Okay, good reason, right. So you think all of these pawns, these weaknesses, these Swiss cheese-like pawns might result in an advantage for MBL. So I think that's a great reason. Now MBL played rook to c5, that's pressuring d5, and it's also giving White the option to pressure another weak pawn, right? What weak pawn can that rook on c5 perhaps target? Yes? Very good, okay, so rook a5 is also in the offing now. And in fact, that's what happened. So kind of an unusual rook lift. Usually when we think about a rook lift, we're thinking about checkmating our opponent's king, rook c3 to g3 or h3. This, on the other hand, is a rook lift created to attack a weak pawn. Any of you guys who watch my championship commentaries know that I like to call that a rover for rook up and over. And here it's definitely an unusual execution of it. So Hou, of course, trying to get a little active here because activity in endgames is really important, right? So instead of trying to well, I don't even think she can defend passively here, but even if she could, in general, it's much better to attack. Knight c4, does that passively defend a6? Well, the problem with knight c4 is more tactical than anything. If you play knight c4, what can I do? It's a little messy.
Of course, you just take the other pawn
It's a little messy, but it looks like it works out for me, yeah. So if I play rook takes d5 here, if you play knight takes a3, I play rook takes d7, and I ended up winning a pawn, right? So the only variation you'd really have to worry about is black maybe attacking something in this position, like bishop e6 or something like that. But the problem here is what? This is actually a little, this one is more messy. But it does look like it works out for white. So what would white do here? Yeah.
Grab the knight.
Give me an exact move.
Sorry, bishop d3 captures knight and c4.
Right, now that would be really good, except black has one potential resource. So what would black try in that position?
Rook captures bishop.
Exactly, rook takes c4, and then white would play what?
And then white would play.
Somebody want to finish up that variation? Knight takes c4, and then what do you think about the position after bishop takes d5?
And there's a knight. There's a 4 moves.
And then after knight to b6, that looks like it's going to be very good for white, because after, what's that? After rook to d8, you have what? Well, what can you do after that rook to, sorry you guys who can't visualize this, but
You can pin it with the other rook.
exactly, rook to d1 looks like that'll be the end of the story. Now that kind of visualization is very important. That's why I didn't move the pieces, because not to annoy people who maybe forgot what I said or something, but if you can't do that, you got to learn, and even if you can, you got to learn to go even deeper. The nice thing about this position is it's kind of like a pawn endgame. There's not a lot of pieces on the board, so it makes it easier to do that visualization. But try doing that when there are twice as many pieces on the board. It becomes more difficult. So that's why you practice in positions like this, and then you get better. So we can take a quick look. So bishop takes d5 obviously loses. Rook takes c4, knight takes c4, bishop d5, knight b6. Now rook d8, and after rook d1, there are no more ideas for black. Black's just going to lose the game. Right? Okay. So, and that all came from the excellent question, why not knight c4 here? So as you can see, there's a lot of tactics in endgames. So instead, rook c3 was played. And now Maxime played another tactical move, rook to b1, allowing rook takes d3, but then after rook takes b6, it's going to be very difficult for black to defend the pawn on a6 and f6, etc. So instead, Hou tried knight to a4, which does a couple things. It removes the knight from attack, and it also attacks the knight on a3. So this is a really messy position for an endgame. And now comes the really shocker move, which I'm sure Hou actually saw this move, bishop to b5. It looks really strange, but at the same time, in a position with so few pieces, a player of her level is going to see that. And the idea is that this pawn cannot capture this bishop because of the pin, and therefore it gets this bishop out of take while attacking this bishop on d7. So just a really cool looking move. So for instance, if instead of bishop f5, which is obviously a better move, if black just tried to take this knight on a3, now white could play bishop takes d7, and black would already be in trouble, because now this knight is in take, and it would seem that the only way to try to get out of it here is knight to c3, right? And now, let's see. What do you guys think here? Pretty messy position, right? So it looks like we have to take this, right? And then after knight takes b1, the material is totally equal, but both black's pieces look like they're in some major trouble. I'm just trying to see if we can actually, how much material we can win here. We can definitely win some material, that's for sure. We could start by just playing, like for instance, one very simple variation to win material is just like we could play rook b3, knight d2, rook here, you know, and just pick up the d pawn. I'm sure there's something better than that though. But in any case, Hou find a much better resource here. Played bishop f5. And now a really sweet move by MBL, like just another really cool move, rook to b3, getting the rook out of take and also attacking the rook on c3. So Hou checked, and then played knight to c3, getting her own knight out of take. Bishop c6, putting pressure on that d5 pawn. And now after rook to d8, rook c5. And things are going to start to get clear up a little bit pretty soon. And then I want to let you guys try playing out this position, actually, when things get a little bit less crazy. So here, after knight b5, there's still tactics going on, right? So he can't play rook takes b5 because the knight on c4 is hanging. So instead, knight to e3 was played. And now, after rook c5, this is where I'd like to give you guys a chance to play this out before we look at the rest of the game. I think the play by Maxime Vachier-Lagrave in this game was quite extraordinary. But I think like one of the things is it's not, if you play over the game quickly, you don't realize quite how masterful the technique of these greats are. For instance, many players here who, you know, you got a lot of the moves correct earlier in the game, but once you're confronted with the position yourself, a lot of people in this position did not play the right move, in which like Maxime continued to put pressure on Hou. I mean, the one thing in this position that's very clear to note is one minor piece is better than the other. Which minor piece is better in this position? Knight. You all said bishop. The knight is better than the bishop here. It's like a beautiful knight. These pawns are in dark squares, so they could become targets later. The knight has a lot of nice landing squares, like d5. This bishop is going to have trouble finding targets and anchors.
But it's a wide open game, and black's got these two pawns very far apart. Why?
Well, it's true that black's bishop does control the b1 square, which would usually be a good thing. But the problem is that it's going to be very difficult for you to even advance the pawn to b4. So if you can't even advance it to b4, then it's going to be kind of very difficult for you ever to get it to b1. Also, there is only one pawn on this side of the board. Once this pawn gets eliminated, or if it gets eliminated, then you'll be left with just two. And it's well known that when there's only pawns on one side of the board that the knight is stronger. So even though that hasn't occurred yet, we're kind of starting to get into that realm. Secondly, in this position, oh no, okay. In this position, the move knight d5 immediately just sets up a bunch of strong threats, right? Knight e7, knight takes f6, and black has to kind of struggle just to hold on here. She played king to h8, kind of trying to like tactically recover, because after knight takes f6, she had in mind rook to e5, and she thought she would get some good counterplay here. But you see, I just think the instinct among players is too quick to trade. We call this trade-itis. Every player pretty much underneath a certain level, and that level is quite high, underneath really the professional level, trades too much. It's extremely rare to find a non-professional chess player who trades too little, right? The reason is because we like releasing the tension. If you make a trade, you know what your opponent's going to play, and that gives us a sense of confidence, right? So there's a lot of psychological reasons behind it, but that means that you shouldn't never trade, but whenever you're confronted in a position where you're tempted to trade, hold back and make sure you have really good reasons and that you're considering other options. Because I'm not going to say that white might have some chances for activity after knight takes f5, but after knight to d5, black has very serious problems, right? So, and you would easily see knight d5 if you didn't have the option of knight takes f5. So it's almost like the option of trading is distracting you from your true goals in the game, which is to win, obviously. And after rook e5, f3, and now after rook to e6, another really nice moment comes. So this is like a nice little tactical idea, because if rook takes e6, now bishop takes e6, and this isn't take, and this isn't take, right? So this can be very problematic. And this, I'm sure, was Hou's original idea when she played king to h8. But here Maxime can do what? Maxime has a good move here.
Maxine is white,
Yeah.
so knight d7, does that work?
Knight d7, interesting. I'm a little worried about the fate of your knight on, it's a good idea, but I think your knight might get trapped on f8. Like, so if knight to d7, rook takes d6, knight takes f8, king g7, seems like a problem. Well, maybe you have rook takes b5 there, but then bishop d3. Yeah,
Knight e4.
knight e4 was played. Really good move. Can't take this knight off with the bishop because then rook takes e6, right? And if you play rook takes d6, knight takes d6. So a really cool move, just kind of getting everything out of take. Nice idea. Oh, this move I love. This blockading move is wonderful. Because somebody pointed out earlier that as this pawn gets going, black's going to get a lot of counterplay. Very beautiful move. Usually you want the rook behind the passed pawn, but in this particular position, blockading it in a situation where you also have this like lateral defense of your knight, it's just a really, really nice move. You're fixing it on this light square as well that you can easily attack it with a knight later. So just a really nice technical move. And now Maxime continued to play some nice moves here. G4 is a very typical move in the endgame, with the idea that we're expanding by playing G5 check, and it's going to be difficult for black with this passive bishop and this passive rook to kind of contest our pawns coming forward. So she tries to get active here, but it's basically not really enough. Game kind of ends really sweetly too. So actually, I think it was resigns here, but I have a couple more moves that I just wanted to show you guys. So now, why is this position so good for white? Suppose black plays bishop b7. What can white do now? Okay, so rook takes rook, and now what?
Walk the pawns down. Walk the pawns down.
What move in particular? There's one move here that's better than the others. Yeah?
G5.
Yes, g5. We call this pawn breakthrough. And if you take on g5, now just h6, and it's impossible to stop this pawn, right? So you can't play bishop d5 to g8. You can't play bishop e4. The king is too slow. So if g5 instead, black would have to play king e7, with the idea that now if pawn takes pawn, at least black can play what? Yeah? What do you think? At least black can play king f6, right? And now, what do you think the best move in this position is? Just to finish it up in style. Then you want to distract him with a knight, but f6 is not the right square, yeah?
Knight e7.
Knight e7 works because now king e7, h7, you can't get the king back. So the only way for black to play is move the bishop. And now, how do you finish off? Knight e6 is really nice because now king g8 doesn't work because of what? King g8 fails to what? Anybody else?
h7.
Yes, h7 check. Setting up, that's what you were going to say too, right? So after h7 check, now king takes h7 allows what? The fork, that's right, knight to f8 check, and the game is over. So really nice technical display by Maxime here. And well, the main things I want you to get out of that is A, trade-itis. You know, be careful about over trading, because a lot of times your advantage in the endgame is slim, and in order to press it, you need to make sure to keep your good pieces and stop your opponent from trading off their bad pieces. And secondly, just something you always want to keep in mind, even though in this position both options were reasonable, you always want to see when your opponent's offering you a trade of queens, think a little bit more than usual, right? Because that could change the entire character of the game and put it into this class, because this is the endgame class. Well, I'll be here for another week and a half, so I hope to see some of you guys next week.